This is the image they told us we would never see: a black screen, a blank map, a situation room in the heart of the Israeli Defense Ministry where, for the first time in the modern history of the Middle East conflict, every single intelligence feed from every single overhead asset went dark simultaneously. It is Tuesday, April 8th, 2026, 2:17 in the morning Tel Aviv time, and the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the Middle East has just been rendered effectively blind, not degraded, not disrupted, blind. Welcome back to World Brief Daily. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that button and turn on your notifications, because what began in the early hours of April 8th is not just a military story. It is not just a technology story. It is a civilizational rupture that is going to reshape the strategic balance of the entire region for the next decade. And the world is only beginning to understand what actually happened. We are talking about a coordinated electromagnetic and cyber operation of a scale and sophistication that experts inside the intelligence community are describing as unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. We are talking about a nation that spent decades and tens of billions of dollars building the most comprehensive satellite-based intelligence architecture in the Middle East, watching that architecture go dark in a window of less than 11 minutes. We are talking about an event that has stripped the Israel Defense Forces of the real-time targeting data, the communications relay infrastructure, and the overhead surveillance capability that every single operational plan, every strike package, every ground maneuver, every hostage rescue scenario is built upon. Buckle up, because the full picture of what happened on April 8th is more alarming, more technically audacious, and more geopolitically consequential than anything you have seen reported in mainstream coverage. Stay with us. Let's start with what Israeli satellite intelligence actually is, because if you don't understand its architecture, you cannot understand why what happened on April 8th constitutes a catastrophe of the first order. Israel operates a constellation of reconnaissance satellites that forms the backbone of its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability, what military planners call their ISR architecture. The OFEC series, the most advanced of which, OFEC 16, was launched in 2020, provides electro-optical and synthetic aperture radar imaging with a resolution capability reportedly below 50 centimeters. That means from orbit, Israeli analysts can identify individual vehicles, read license plates under certain conditions, monitor the movement of personnel in and out of underground facilities. This is the eye that Mossad uses to track weapons shipments. This is the sensor that IDF targeting planners rely on to build strike packages. This is the surveillance layer that feeds the Unit 8200 signals intelligence infrastructure and the AI-driven targeting systems that Israeli forces have deployed across the region since the conflict with Iran erupted on February 28, 2026. Sources inside the Israeli defense establishment, speaking on condition of anonymity, have described the OFEC constellation as the single most irreplaceable asset in Israel's wartime intelligence chain. It is not just one tool among many. It is the foundation layer on which everything else is built. Lose the satellites, and you lose the ability to confirm targets before you strike them. You lose the ability to assess battle damage after you strike them. You lose the ability to track the movement of mobile missile launchers across a country the size of Iran. You lose the early warning layer that tells you whether a ballistic missile has left its silo before your ground radar even detects it. In modern high-intensity conflict, that is not a setback. That is an amputation. But here's the catch. The OFEC constellation was not destroyed. It was jammed. And that distinction is everything, because destroying a satellite requires either a direct ascent anti-satellite missile, a co-orbital kinetic kill vehicle, or a directed energy weapon. Iran possesses none of those at the level required to target an OFEC-class satellite with confidence. What Iran appears to have deployed is something altogether different and in many ways more alarming. What sources describing the incident as an electromagnetic warfare operation on a scale never before seen in a live conflict zone are calling a multi-layered radio frequency denial campaign. The uplink frequencies, the downlink frequencies, the command and control channels, the backup relay bands, all of them targeted, all of them saturated, all of them rendered unusable across an 11-minute window beginning at 2:17 a.m. Tel Aviv time on April 8th, 2026. Let's talk about how this is technically possible, because the engineering behind it is extraordinary and the implications extend far beyond this specific conflict. Satellite jamming operates on a simple but devastating principle. You do not need to destroy the satellite. You need to overwhelm the signal. Ground-based jamming systems, what the technical literature describes as uplink jammers and downlink jammers, can flood the frequency bands a satellite uses to receive commands and transmit data with enough radio frequency noise to render those communications unintelligible. The satellite itself continues to orbit perfectly. It continues to function exactly as designed, but the data it collects cannot be transmitted back to the ground station, and commands from the ground station cannot reach the satellite's onboard systems. From the perspective of every operator sitting in front of an intelligence terminal in Tel Aviv, the satellite is simply gone. A black square where a high-resolution image feed used to be. According to leaked technical assessments reviewed by defense industry analysts, what made the April 8th event categorically different from prior jamming incidents, of which there have been many in this conflict, was the simultaneous targeting of multiple frequency bands across multiple satellite systems, not just OFEC. Sources say the operation affected Israeli relay satellites, the military communications constellation that Israeli forces use to coordinate operations across the theater, and at least 2 commercially leased imaging platforms that IDF planners had been using to supplement their organic ISR capability since the beginning of the war. The data shows this was not opportunistic interference. This was a planned, coordinated, precisely timed campaign executed across multiple frequency domains simultaneously. That level of coordination requires years of preparation, detailed intelligence on Israeli satellite operational frequencies, and jamming hardware capable of radiating across a broad swath of the electromagnetic spectrum with enough power density to overwhelm satellite uplinks from the ground. Nobody's talking about the fact that Iran apparently had all 3. Now, here is where it becomes truly remarkable. The jamming did not last 11 minutes. The initial blackout window was 11 minutes. What followed was something that intelligence professionals are describing with genuine alarm as an electronic warfare kill chain. Because when the Israeli technicians attempted to switch to backup frequencies, those frequencies were already jammed. When they attempted to redirect command uplinks through Allied relay systems, sources say those relay pathways were degraded as well. When they activated the emergency frequency protocols that represent the last-ditch communication option for the OFEC constellation, the jamming systems tracking Israeli responses adapted in near real time and followed them. This is the behavior of an adversary that has done this before, at least in testing. This is the behavior of an adversary that studied Israeli satellite operations in exhaustive detail, mapped their frequency hopping protocols, anticipated their emergency fallback procedures, and built jamming architecture specifically designed to deny each layer of redundancy in sequence. That is not improvisation. That is a campaign. The secondary consequences of the blackout began cascading within minutes, and this is where the word catastrophe stops being hyperbole. According to sources close to the IDF command structure, the loss of satellite connectivity did not merely degrade intelligence collection. It collapsed the real-time data links between IDF command and control systems and forward deployed units operating inside Iranian territory and across the broader operational theater. We are talking about strike packages that were in the planning phase at the moment of the blackout, suddenly lacking the targeting confirmation data required to authorize launch. We are talking about air assets already airborne on patrol missions, suddenly operating without the satellite relayed threat picture their electronic warfare suites depend on. We are talking about special operations teams in the field losing the encrypted satellite communications links they rely on for mission coordination, exfiltration planning, and emergency extraction. The disruption was not confined to intelligence analysts staring at blank screens. It cascaded through the entire operational nervous system of a military at war. It gets worse. Sources say that within 30 minutes of the initial blackout, Iranian forces executed what appears to have been a pre-planned kinetic operation timed to exploit the intelligence gap. In the 48 hours preceding April 8th, Israeli surveillance assets had been tracking what sources describe as an unusual pattern of activity at 3 Iranian missile storage facilities in the western Zagros mountain region. Tracking that activity, that was the specific intelligence thread that the OFAC system was actively monitoring when the blackout occurred. And in the window of degraded Israeli visibility that followed, those 3 facilities went operationally dark themselves. Trucks moved, transporter erector launchers relocated. The precisely mapped threat picture that Israeli planners had been building for weeks on those facilities became obsolete in a window of less than 2 hours. The missiles, reportedly Shahab-3 derivatives with a range capable of reaching the Israeli coast, are now at locations unknown. Let's talk about the Mossad dimension of this, because the satellite blackout was not the only intelligence catastrophe that unfolded on April 8th, and the connections between what happened in space and what happened on the ground are being described by analysts as deeply alarming. According to sources with knowledge of Israeli intelligence operations, the electromagnetic blackout coincided with what appears to have been a coordinated counterintelligence sweep inside Iran. Israeli intelligence reportedly maintains a network of human assets inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Iranian missile program, built painstakingly over decades and at extraordinary cost in lives and resources. On the night of April 8th, according to leaked reports circulating in regional intelligence circles, Iranian security services moved simultaneously against multiple nodes of what they appear to have identified as an Israeli human intelligence network. We are talking about a coordinated series of arrests and, in at least 2 reported cases, killings carried out with a precision that suggests Iran either penetrated that network or used the intelligence vacuum created by the satellite blackout to execute a sweep they had been planning for weeks. This is not confirmed, but the pattern is too coherent to be coincidental. The psychological impact of these simultaneous strikes, the electromagnetic blinding, and the apparent decimation of on-the-ground human intelligence assets on Israeli command echelons cannot be overstated. Here is what you need to understand about the psychology of military command when the intelligence layer goes dark. Military commanders do not simply wait for the intelligence to come back. They face an impossible choice between acting on stale or incomplete intelligence and accepting the risk that the operational window is closing, or holding until visibility is restored and accepting the risk that the adversary has used that window to reposition and rearm. In military planning, this is called the decision superiority gap. And on the morning of April 8th, 2026, Iran appears to have opened that gap deliberately, specifically, and with devastating effect. But here's what nobody is talking about. The jamming capability Iran deployed on April 8th did not emerge from nowhere. It represents the culmination of an investment arc that began, according to defense analysts tracking Iranian military modernization, following the Stuxnet operation of 2009-2010, when Iran concluded with absolute certainty that its adversaries were willing and capable of deploying sophisticated electronic and cyber means against critical Iranian infrastructure. The lesson Iran drew from Stuxnet was not simply defensive. According to sources tracking Iranian military procurement patterns over the past 15 years, Tehran concluded that the electromagnetic domain was both an asymmetric equalizer and a potential strategic multiplier. A country that cannot match its adversary's conventional air power, that cannot field a comparable air defense network, that cannot protect its underground facilities against penetration munitions, can still potentially blind that adversary's entire intelligence architecture at a critical moment. That insight produced 15 years of investment, reportedly involving Russian technical assistance and Chinese electromagnetic warfare technology transfers that Western intelligence agencies have been tracking with growing alarm. The April 8th operation was not improvised. It was the product of a 15-year developmental program finally deployed at the moment of maximum strategic effect. Now let's walk through what a worst-case continuation of this scenario looks like over the next 72 hours, because the strategic situation is genuinely at a knife's edge. Scenario 1, the jamming campaign is sustained or resumed. Iran does not need to jam continuously to maintain the strategic advantage. Each time Israeli technicians work to restore satellite links and adapt their frequency protocols, a subsequent jamming campaign forces them to burn through another layer of their communications redundancy architecture. The OFEC satellites have finite onboard processing capability. The ground station infrastructure has finite bandwidth for emergency frequency hopping. Sources familiar with the technical architecture say that 3 to 4 sustained jamming cycles of the kind executed on April 8th could degrade Israeli satellite communications capability to a level that would require months of costly reconfiguration to restore. The economic cost of that reconfiguration, according to defense procurement specialists, would run to hundreds of millions of dollars and potentially well above $500 million when you account for the emergency satellite launches that might be required to replace compromised orbital assets. But the military cost would be measured not in dollars, but in the decisions that cannot be made, the strikes that cannot be confirmed, the intelligence gaps that cannot be filled. Scenario 2, and this is the one that regional analysts are describing as the scenario that keeps military planners awake at night. Iran uses the intelligence vacuum to execute a mass salvo strike from the repositioned launchers that disappeared from Israeli tracking during the April 8th blackout. Iran demonstrated during the broader conflict that began on February 28th its willingness and capability to execute large-scale ballistic and cruise missile attacks. The April 8th satellite blackout eliminated, at least temporarily, the overhead surveillance layer that Israeli forces rely on to detect pre-launch preparations at mobile missile launch sites. If those mobile launchers are preparing to fire from positions that are now unknown to Israeli intelligence, the warning time for Israeli missile defense systems, already operating under extraordinary strain since the beginning of the conflict, could be reduced to minutes. That is not a manageable tactical problem. That is a potential catastrophe for Israeli civilian population centers. Let's talk about the IDF command structure crisis, because the satellite blackout is not just an intelligence problem. It is a command and control collapse in slow motion. Sources inside the Israeli defense establishment describe the morning of April 8th as a situation room in which the most fundamental tool of modern military command, shared situational awareness, the common operating picture that commanders at every level depend on to understand what is happening across the battlefield, simply ceased to function as designed. The IDF has invested billions of shekels, reportedly over $3.2 billion in the current budget cycle alone, in what military planners call network-centric warfare capabilities. The entire doctrine of the IDF's multi-domain operations concept is built on the assumption of persistent overhead surveillance, providing the data backbone for every other capability. Armor units coordinating with air assets, naval forces integrating with strike aircraft, special operations teams synchronizing with signals intelligence feeds. All of it, every piece of it, depends on the satellite communications architecture that went dark at 2:17 a.m. on April 8th. The psychological warfare dimension of what Iran has executed here deserves its own analysis, because it is extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily targeted. Here's what you need to understand about the specific message Iran is sending with the April 8th operation. It is not primarily a military message. It is a political and psychological message directed at multiple audiences simultaneously. To the Israeli public, it says, your government's promise that advanced technology makes you safe is not as solid as you were told. To the IDF officer corps, it says, the operational doctrine you have built your careers on has a vulnerability that your adversary has found and exploited. To Israel's international partners, particularly Washington, it says, the military relationship you have built with Israel, the intelligence sharing architecture, the joint operational planning, all of it sits on a foundation that has just been demonstrably cracked. And to the broader Muslim and Arab world, it says something that carries enormous political weight. Iran made Israel go blind. According to sources tracking Iranian state media, Tehran has been extraordinarily restrained in its public statements about the April 8th operation. There has been no triumphant announcement, no parade of satellite imagery showing blank screens, no televised press conference from a Revolutionary Guard commander, and that restraint is itself part of the psychological operation. Because by not claiming the operation explicitly, Iran forces Israel into an impossible choice: acknowledge the blackout publicly, which confirms to every adversary in the region that Israel's satellite architecture has a demonstrated vulnerability that Iran has the capability to exploit at will. Or stay silent, which means the Israeli public and political class are making decisions about this conflict without being informed of a development that fundamentally changes the strategic picture. Neither option is good. Both options are exactly what Tehran wants. Here's where the geopolitical cascade begins. Because Israel's satellite intelligence architecture is not purely Israeli. Sources say the OFEC constellation operates in close integration with American intelligence assets and shares data with Five Eyes partners through established liaison channels. The jamming of Israeli satellite systems is therefore not merely a bilateral Israel-Iran problem. It is an event that has degraded a node in the Western intelligence network. American intelligence officials, according to leaked reports, have been described as deeply alarmed by the scope and sophistication of the April 8th operation, and specifically by what it implies about Iran's knowledge of Western satellite operational frequencies and protocols. Because the same electronic warfare architecture that jammed the OFEC constellation can, in principle, be directed at other systems operating in similar frequency domains. The question being asked in urgent classified briefings in Washington, according to sources familiar with those discussions, is not whether Iran has the capability. The April 8th event answered that question definitively. The question is, what else has Iran mapped? What other frequency architectures has Tehran been studying for the past 15 years as part of the same developmental program that produced the April 8th operation? The international reaction has followed the fault lines of the broader conflict with remarkable predictability. Russia, through state media channels, has been conspicuously silent, a silence that carries its own meaning given Moscow's deep technical involvement in Iranian military modernization. China's foreign ministry issued a pro forma statement calling for de-escalation that was noticed and noted precisely because of how carefully it avoided any characterization of the April 8th incident. The Gulf states, which publicly depend on the Israeli intelligence architecture as a counterweight to Iranian regional power, have activated diplomatic channels with a level of urgency that sources describe as extraordinary. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain are all reported to have requested emergency intelligence briefings through their liaison channels with Israeli and American counterparts. For those governments, the April 8th event is not an abstraction. It is a reminder that the intelligence architecture they rely on for their own national security is interconnected with Israeli systems that have just been demonstrably compromised. The nuclear dimension of this story cannot be passed over, because here is what the Israeli satellite blackout means for the single most consequential question in the entire Iran crisis: the status of Iran's nuclear program. The IAEA has been conducting what it describes as enhanced monitoring of Iran's declared nuclear facilities since the conflict began on February 28th. But the undeclared facilities, the suspected weaponization research sites, the locations that Western intelligence agencies have been tracking through signals intelligence and overhead imagery, those sites depend entirely on the kind of overhead surveillance capability that Israel lost on April 8th. Sources familiar with the intelligence picture say that the specific facilities for which Israeli overhead surveillance provided the most critical and least replaceable coverage are precisely the facilities about which the least is known from other intelligence sources. The satellite blackout, therefore, does not merely create a temporary intelligence gap. It creates a window during which Iran could potentially relocate sensitive nuclear materials or equipment without overhead detection. That is a scenario that American and Israeli officials have described in prior briefings to congressional committees as among the most concerning possible outcomes of any degradation of Israeli ISR capability. That scenario is not hypothetical anymore. Let's talk about the ceasefire context and what April 8th means for the Islamabad negotiations, because the timing of this operation is not coincidental and cannot be understood outside the diplomatic picture. As previously reported, Iran accepted a 2-week ceasefire with talks set for Islamabad following American pressure and the suspension of U.S. strikes. The ceasefire negotiations were premised on a specific intelligence assumption that both sides could monitor the other's military preparations with sufficient fidelity to detect cheating and respond before any advantage became irreversible. The April 8th satellite blackout has fundamentally undermined that assumption on the Israeli side. Israel is now negotiating a ceasefire while functionally blind to the military preparations of the party with which it is negotiating. That is not just a tactical disadvantage, it is a verification crisis, because a ceasefire that cannot be verified is not a ceasefire. It is a political fiction that one side can exploit while the other trusts. Sources say that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu convened an emergency session of the Security Cabinet within 90 minutes of the initial April 8th blackout at approximately 3:45 a.m. Tel Aviv time. The discussion, according to individuals with knowledge of the meeting, centered on 3 questions: the duration and reversibility of the intelligence gap, the risk of Iranian kinetic exploitation of that gap, and whether Israel's commitment to the Islamabad ceasefire process could be maintained under conditions of compromised verification capability. None of those questions had satisfying answers. The intelligence gap had not been restored at the time of the Security Cabinet meeting. The risk of kinetic exploitation was assessed as elevated, specifically because of the repositioning of mobile missile launchers during the blackout window. And the question of ceasefire commitment was left deliberately unresolved, which is itself a signal of extraordinary institutional stress. When a Security Cabinet meeting convened at 3:45 in the morning cannot reach a resolution on whether a ceasefire remains operative, you are looking at command paralysis, not deliberate policy. Now let's go deeper on the worst-case scenario that is genuinely haunting regional security analysts and that has, according to sources, been briefed to senior American officials as a possibility that cannot be dismissed. The scenario is this: Iran's April 8th operation was not a standalone demonstration of electromagnetic warfare capability. It was the opening phase of a sequenced operational plan that uses the intelligence vacuum to enable something much more consequential. Here is the sequence as analysts piece it together. Phase 1, the satellite blackout, occurred on April 8th, stripping Israeli forces of real-time overhead surveillance and degrading IDF command and control communications. Phase 2, which may have already begun, involves the repositioning of mobile ballistic missile launchers to pre-surveyed locations in Iran's western mountain ranges, locations that were mapped and prepared specifically to be outside the coverage zones that Israeli planners rely on for early warning detection. Phase 3, according to this worst-case assessment, would involve a coordinated salvo launch from those launchers at a moment of Iranian choosing, potentially timed to coincide with another jamming cycle that further degrades Israeli missile defense coordination. The Israeli Arrow 3 system, the David's Sling battery network, the Iron Dome layers that protect population centers, all of them depend on networked fire control systems that in turn depend on the same satellite communications architecture that was demonstrated as jammable on April 8th. The worst-case scenario is not a military defeat in the field. The worst-case scenario is a mass casualty event on Israeli soil resulting from a salvo that missile defense systems could not fully coordinate against because their communications were degraded by an adversary that had spent 15 years preparing exactly that capability. The economic cost of such an event, the human cost, the political cost, the existential implications for the Israeli government's claim that it can protect its citizens, that scenario, if it materializes, would be measured in lives rather than dollars. Let us now step back from the immediate crisis and place what is happening in its proper historical context, because that context is essential to understanding both the magnitude of what has occurred and what it tells us about where this conflict is going. In the long history of warfare, there have been a small number of pivotal moments when a new form of warfare capability was demonstrated at scale for the first time and fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of every military in the world. The use of submarines in the First World War demonstrated that control of the sea surface no longer guaranteed control of the sea. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that air power, properly deployed, could compel even a dominant land army to abandon a strategic objective. The Israeli Six-Day War of 1967 demonstrated that preemptive airstrikes against enemy airfields could achieve theater-wide air superiority in hours rather than days or weeks. In each of these cases, a capability was demonstrated, military establishments around the world absorbed the lesson, and doctrines changed accordingly. April 8th, 2026 may be one of those moments. The demonstration that a mid-tier regional power can simultaneously jam the entire satellite communications and intelligence architecture of a technologically sophisticated adversary across multiple frequency domains with sufficient precision to deny backup protocols and emergency fallback systems is a demonstration that will be studied in war colleges from West Point to Beijing for generations. And here's the constitutional and institutional dimension of what this means for Israel specifically, because the domestic political crisis that has erupted in Tel Aviv in the hours following the public acknowledgement of the blackout is as consequential as the military situation itself. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu has staked its political survival on a specific argument that Israeli technological superiority and intelligence dominance make Israel safe even in the context of a grinding multi-front war against Iran and its proxy network. Every investment in the satellite constellation, every billion spent on Unit 8200, every showcase of the Mossad's ability to penetrate and disrupt Iranian programs has been deployed as evidence for that argument. April 8th has not merely damaged that argument. It has done something more dangerous. It has raised the question of whether the Israeli public has been told the truth about the actual vulnerabilities in the systems they were told made them safe. Sources inside the Knesset describe opposition politicians preparing emergency parliamentary inquiries into what ministers knew about Iran's electromagnetic warfare development program, when they knew it, and whether the public was given an accurate picture of the risks. That is the language of a constitutional crisis in formation, not a routine political debate. The Israeli public's reaction to the April 8th events has moved through several distinct phases in the hours since the blackout became publicly known. Initially, there was shock and a kind of disbelief, sources say, that manifested on social media platforms as a flood of commentary questioning the reports. Then anger, specifically the kind of fury that comes not from unexpected bad news, but from the feeling of betrayal, from the sense that institutions that were supposed to protect you and tell you the truth had done neither. Tel Aviv news broadcasts that ran footage of blank satellite imagery screens and empty situation room displays hit an audience that had already been through months of missile attacks, proxy threats, and economic disruption. The psychological cumulative effect of that footage, coming on top of everything that has already happened since February 28th, is being described by Israeli political psychologists as a breaking point event, not the end of public support for the war, but a fundamental shattering of the specific confidence that what Israel does in space is unchallengeable. Watch what happens now, because the next 30 days are going to define the entire trajectory of this conflict. Watch whether Israeli forces attempt to demonstrate restored intelligence capability through a high-profile precision strike against a target in Iran that signals full situational awareness has been recovered. That would be the behavior of a military trying to send a deterrence signal. Watch whether the Islamabad ceasefire talks proceed, collapse, or are suspended pending the resolution of the verification crisis. Watch whether the United States moves additional electronic warfare assets into the theater, specifically the EA-18G Growler aircraft and the ground-based electronic warfare systems that American forces use to counter jamming campaigns. Watch whether Iran executes another jamming cycle, which would signal that April 8th was the opening phase of a sustained electromagnetic campaign rather than a one-time demonstration. And watch, above all, the behavior of those mobile missile launchers whose location has been lost. Because when they reappear, the question of what they are carrying and where they are pointed will be the most consequential intelligence question in the Middle East. History has a grim record when it comes to situations where one party in a conflict acquires, even briefly, a decisive intelligence advantage over an adversary that did not see it coming. The 1973 Yom Kippur War remains the most painful chapter in Israeli military history, precisely because it demonstrated what happens when intelligence assumptions are wrong at the moment of maximum danger. Israeli commanders in October 1973 had satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human reporting that individually told pieces of the truth, but that collectively failed to prevent strategic surprise. What happened on April 8, 2026, is different in nature, but similar in potential consequence. It is not a failure of analysis. It is the temporary elimination of the analytical foundation itself, and the window created by that elimination, even if it lasts hours rather than days, may be enough for an adversary that has prepared for 15 years for exactly this moment to create facts on the ground that cannot be easily reversed. The doctrine of Israeli intelligence dominance, the belief that the combination of Mossad, Unit 8200, and the overhead constellation created an intelligence architecture that was fundamentally unchallengeable by regional adversaries, has been placed under serious question. April 8th was the most visible, most dramatic, most technically sophisticated test of that doctrine in the history of the conflict. And in those 11 minutes of darkness beginning at 2:17 in the morning, Tel Aviv time, the echoes of a strategic era may have begun to fade. This story is not over, not even close. The Islamabad ceasefire remains fragile. The missing missile launchers remain missing. The Iranian electromagnetic warfare architecture that produced April 8th remains intact and operational. And the questions about what else Iran has mapped, what other frequency domains it can target, what other layers of Western and Israeli intelligence architecture it has spent 15 years studying for exactly this contingency, those questions do not have answers yet. We will keep you updated as this situation develops. If this analysis gave you the deeper picture that you cannot get anywhere else, then you know what to do. Subscribe to World Brief Daily. Turn on your notifications because the next chapter of this story is already being written, and you need to be here when it breaks.